All right, boys and girls, today we're going to talk about Lesson 5 from Unit 1, and it's called War and Changes. It begins on page 40 in your book. What we're going to talk about today is that by the year 1850, there were differences between the North and South, specifically slavery. And this big difference was threatening to split our country into two. As each new territory became a state, people in the North and the South argued about whether slavery should be allowed there. There were different ways of life in the South and in the North. In the South, the economy was dependent on slaves, whereas in the North, the economy was dependent on people that worked in factories. And in fact, slavery was illegal in the North, in the blue states. So in the election of 1861, there was a man that was elected president. His name was Abraham Lincoln in 1861. And Lincoln was against the spread of slavery. He said, slavery's around, that's fine, but I don't want it to become spread out any more than it is. And many Southerners were afraid that Lincoln wanted to completely get rid of slavery altogether. So one by one, all of these states in the South began to leave the Union. And they actually started forming their own union called the Confederate States of America. And they elected a president. His name was Jefferson Davis. And in April of 1861, over here in Fort Sumter, South Carolina, Confederate troops started firing on the fort. And that began the Civil War. The Civil War was between the Union up north and the Confederates down south. And any war between different parts of the same nation, that's called a civil war. And there are two sides to the Civil War. There's the South and the North. And it kind of becomes this kind of comparison and contrast. So if I were to pull up, circles here, I could say, the South is one way and, the North is another. And the things they have in common, are things like both sides need food, they both need clothing and supplies for their troops. But the South, in the war, they had skilled soldiers. Their soldiers were trained really well, and they grew cotton. They didn't grow food, which is something that they needed. While in the North, they had a larger population. There were more people in the North than in the South. And they had factories to make weapons and uniforms and supplies. So they had more food, they had railroads, but their soldiers weren't as skilled. The war went on for a few years until the year 1863. And that's when President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation in January 1st of 1863 said that all enslaved people in the Confederacy shall be free, forever free. And this, in essence, ended slavery. So during the war, more than 600,000 people died. Finally, 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, on April 9th of 1865, the Confederacy surrendered. They surrendered the war after 4 years of fighting. So it's kind of a great thing. The war's over. However, there's some sadness because right after that, in fact, 5 days after that, President Lincoln was assassinated while he was watching a play in Washington, D.C. After the war, there was this time called Reconstruction. Now, what Reconstruction means, the prefix re, R-E, means that you do it again. So to reconstruct means that you're going to build or construct again. And this is a title that we give this time after the Civil War. It's called Reconstruction. Now, there was a new president at this time. His name was President Jefferson. And his plan was to have the southern states pledge their loyalty to the Union and that they were going to have to abolish slavery. So by the fall of 1865, every state but Texas had rejoined the nation. Congress also had to amend the Constitution, and what that means is they changed it. The changes were written in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. They made slavery illegal. They said that all people born in the United States were citizens, and they gave all male citizens the right to vote and protected the rights of all citizens. But this really led to an area called this led to an area that an era that said that even after the Civil War was done, there were still tensions between the North and the South. So even though all slavery had been made illegal, life was still hard for many African Americans living in the South. Some moved to places in the North, while others struggled to make a living in the segregated South. Some were never reunited with their families. But what happened was this idea of segregation. Segregation means that people are separated because of race or ethnicity. And it led to this thing called Jim Crow laws. And these are laws put into place that made this segregation, the splitting or separation of people, it made them legal. Well, during this time, there were a lot of changes. Well, think about it. How did, we had immigrants from all over the world moving to the Great Plains for inexpensive land. Settlers took land away from Native Americans, and in fact, they had to go into smaller reservations. The population of the United States grew by a lot during this time. Also during the time, technology was starting to come around to change lives. So, for example, there was farm machinery, other inventions, and an invention is just a new way to do things or some sort of like new machine. So inventions such as the farm machinery and telephones, electric lights, steel, which was a big invention that led to changing the way that we built things. So how did new inventions such as farm machinery or the telephone change life in the United States? Well, telephones made communication easier. Advances in farm machinery allowed for fewer workers to cultivate more land. So the idea is that in this lesson, what we've talked about is the North having industry and the Civil War began. Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which said that all slaves were free. Reconstruction began after that, and the nation is then starting to be rebuilt. Immigrants, moved to the plains, and then new ideas and inventions make progress. Thanks for listening.